Good evening, welcome live and remote. My name is Lukas Feireiss, and this is the third session of the Studium Generale's Juxtaposition public lecture series here at the Berlin University of the Arts on the topic of contemporary cultural production. A lecture series that aims to provoke and inspire a broad, cross-disciplinary audience within and beyond the school, a lecture series that takes a personal look at professional practices of artists, architects, designers, curators, writers, and thinkers worldwide that have one thing in common. They simply don't fit into just one category, into just one box, discipline, or profession. They're all coloring outside the lines. That said, I'm thrilled to have writer, critic, and visual theorist of Omsk Social Club here with us tonight. It was actually our common friend and colleague, the curator Georgie Pope, who introduced me to your work in the first place, and I was immediately fascinated by your approach that seemed to blend disciplines, media, technology, and life as we know it. Omsk Social Club is, and please correct me in the following 45 minutes if I'm wrong, it's an artist collective that you represent here tonight that situates itself in between our physical and virtual reality, or as you call it, between URL and IRL, through the medium of game and play, or the method of game and play. And thereby you create very intensive and immersive environments or situations or installations that in a way hack and disrupt and crack psychological and collective and organizational structures, at least as far as I read this, and patterns, and invite the participating, let's call them players, to experience alternate realities, set within the context of our everyday lives, though, for short or extended periods of time. So, Omsk Social Club exhibits across Europe in various institutions, galleries, theaters, offsites, biennales, and festivals. In this year, you also co-curated the 7th Athens Biennale together with Larry Ossei-Mensah. Welcome, Omsk Social Club. Make sure that your mic is on, by the way.
Sorry?
Is your mic on?
Thank you so much, Lukas, for this introduction. And thank you so much for joining us, both in the room and out. So I want to talk a little bit about Omsk Social Club through the works that we do together, and also maybe touching on some of the reasons why we create the work that we do, and why we think it's important to have those processes in the world right now. I actually don't either. I just want to make sure I have the time. So, Omsk Social Club is a roaming collective. It sprawls and recoils depending on its form or output. It was established in 2016 and performs itself as a facilitator of role-playing environments inside the contemporary art world, both live and through participation as performance from the viewers that enact that space. As a group, we work closely with a network of core and public players. Everything is typically unique and unrehearsed, and the game designs and installations are created to examine virtual egos, popular experiences, and political phenomena. We try to allow the works to become a kind of dematerialized hybrid of modern-day culture, alongside the participants, viewers, whatever we wish to call the people that embody those spaces, own personal experiences. In the past, we've introduced landscapes and topics such as the ontology of the avatar, rave culture, survivalism, catfishing, desire and sacrifice, positive coding, algorithmic strategies, and decentralized cryptocurrency. Omsk Social Club has a concept, has always kind of pitted itself in this space called bleed, which is half reality, half fiction, and the door is kind of left open between the two. Omsk proposes the contents and makings as a form of kind of post-political entertainment in attempt to shadow play politics until the game ruptures the surface we now know as life or consensual reality. In the field of role play, you would call this bleed. And in a sense, bleed is the space between a kind of fictional world and the world that we normally inhabit on a day-to-day basis. And the kind of space between this sort of chasm or tunnel is the osmosis between them. And this is what's typically known in role-playing life as bleed. So in a sense, the diagram that you can see in front of you, there's these three different scenes. On the left-hand side, to the top, is one of our works, which was a crypto rave series that we ran with Media Group Bitnix, and we ran 9 of them in total. This one was done in Athens. And basically, this particular work was very much about bringing the modes of using decentralized cryptocurrency to form events and happenings into the viewer's own room before it's actually brought into the exhibition space, which was clubs across Europe. And the way in which they did that was basically through a kind of Monero mining unit, which is one way where you can collectively mine cryptocurrency from your own personal computer in your own home. So as a viewer, you would typically set up this Monero mining unit. You'd have to mine for 11 hours, and over the course of that 11 hours, you would get your ticket, you would get a character identity, the location, and so forth. So in a way, all of the kind of baggage to see the exhibition would be loaded onto your computer before you even set foot into the exhibition space. And then, of course, it was set up as a rave installation, which had people like Bill Kurliger, Smash, Crystal Mess, Primitive Art, Yarling playing. So as well, you can sort of see that we often collaborate en masse with other peers through our networks when we produce pieces. So this image here, it looks reasonably similar to the image on the top of the left, which is actually a tonal festival 2 years ago. And then underneath that, you have an image from a Netflix series, which was basically exploring Berlin nightlife. And in a way, why I want to try to show you these 3 images is also to talk a little bit about bleed and how the world of art creation can often mimic or kind of create an uncanniness towards the life that we typically live within. And this is very much what really kind of inspires us, or where we like really position a lot of our works. And I just want to speak a little bit further about bleed as a concept before introducing some of those works. So bleed is actually a kind of rather disputed tool inside the role-playing genre. And role-playing, of course, is often situated within what we would call LARP, so live action role-playing. These communities tend to ignore this term bleed, or they don't encourage it, let's say, or they don't cultivate it. And this kind of phenomenon known as bleed is typically within like role-playing environments, is when the character actually affects the person who's playing it out in-game, or vice versa, when actually the person is affecting the character and kind of trying to remodel the character based on their own intentions or wants. Of course, I'm sure we can all think about moments where we've tried to role-play a situation to manipulate something or somebody. And in a sense, this is a little bit what this bleed is. But as a kind of phenomena, I think it has this sort of like multiple different heads. It's sort of a kind of many-headed hydra, which also is the reason why we're kind of obsessed with it and keep returning back to this material or ontology. The reason why quite a lot inside LARP that people sort of push against this notion of bleed is because they feel that once you have stepped over those boundaries, it's very, very hard to get back to reality. And this, in a sense, kind of puts the fear of God into a lot of role-playing communities. But it's something that we're extremely interested in, about cultivating with the right sort of set of tools and with the right view or lens to look at that. And hopefully I'll be able to unpack that within the art context in a second. So what normally people are very afraid of, as opposed in relation to the notion of bleed, is mostly online when you're looking through role-playing forums around the notion of bleed. People are very afraid of it when it comes to love. Because in a sense, they say that often if you play a character who's in love with somebody, then actually you want that afterwards, and you can't kind of separate these two entities. Now, as far as Omsk Social Club is concerned, we don't typically make works about love, but it seems that in the role-playing world, outside of that, this is actually the kind of real pushback against it, which, of course, love is complicated and unbearable and very difficult subject matter, both in role-played and lived reality. In a sense, a lot of ways in which this terminology bleed become very interesting to us is that actually moment of how you can become so close to something that it feels authentically real. And that actually kind of asks the question as well, but isn't everything not authentically real? Because, even when you are role-playing something or you're experiencing something, then that is an experience in itself. The idea of real and what we can learn from bastardizing real is sort of why Omsk Social Club started and why we create these kind of fictive and alternative worlds to live inside. And why we kind of argue for bleed, and all our works are played within these bleed zones. We do not really focus on love bleed, as I said, as an experience, although actually some people have had that kind of moment when we actually have debriefs within our works. But we're more interested in using bleed as a kind of tool for compression, solidarity, trauma, release, othering, and also speculative moments about wondering what would be worth taking over to consensual reality. And this is not to say that all of the experiences or all of the things that we look closely at inside our works should actually be immortal or absolute after they've been conceived by the works or the participant or viewer. Instead, we think about using this space of bleed as a point of departure beyond the moments of kind of extreme emotional manifestation. And in a way, if we look back at art history, actually this kind of notion of possession that most people are very afraid of when it comes to bleed is something that's inherent in art. Like a really amazing piece of artwork is something that you can't get out of your head, something that you take over into your everyday life. It possesses you. And that's, of course, for better or worse. I mean, it also doesn't just happen within art. You can also find that in literature or film. I mean, thinking about right now sci-fi as a tool of working out what reality we're going to live inside. There is a lot of speak about speculative fictions actually becoming models of our day-to-day. And that's not necessarily because they've created these seamless infrastructures of worlds, but also because people are possessed by them. Think about Silicon Valley. It was pretty much the fan fiction of artists and writers, particularly William Gibson, who wrote Neuromancer, and then those readers actually took those ideas and concepts into, well, right now, present reality, and that's kind of what we're living in. And I think that sort of moment where art actually influences our ways of living is something that we're super interested in. And that's not always so easily tangible as to like the moment, okay, reading Neuromancer, and then like, okay, the renaming of Facebook as Meta, of course, according to the metaverse, which I think happened like 48 hours ago. Obviously, that line is like through multiple decades, and it's not so easy to like trace the absolute from start to finish. But you can find a lot of these relics of these literature sitting inside of the everyday now, even though it was 2 or 3 decades ago. So this hopefully explains a little bit of the things that we're kind of infatuated with and the reason why we keep making work. We started in 2016 obsessed with this notion of bleed, and the first works that were initially played were actually played in private between different peer sets. But we went public in 2017 with a work called Play Rave, which was in Zurich, and it had around 400 live identities and was set just outside of the city. And to find the location, you had to follow the Limit River out of the city under a motorway bypass and into this first alpine forest clearing. It was set up as an illegal rave, supported by Kashev, who are a local Zurich crew. The work ran for 6 hours, starting at midnight. Players at random were given identities that they applied for via an open call. The characters had been constructed from looking at and speaking to 4 different generations of crews, promoters, DJs, producers, dancers, and cult figures in the Zurich illegal rave scene. They'd been putting on raves from as early as the 1980s. So basically we had collected a huge amount of interviews from people that were either we were connected to, or through these interviews we've got further people that we're connected to. And from collecting all of these interviews, we then kind of distilled these 400 characters, which were then interlocked with contemporary narratives and framings that were happening in the present day of 2017. The identities weren't constructed from facts, but actually they were constructed more from emotions and sort of socio-political ideas. And people were actually interviewed not on the history of illegal raves, but actually on their attitudes and politics and kind of nostalgic events that occurred, their lives and memories and crushes and pains. And the person who was interviewed, actually, all of this was anonymous. So you didn't get like a quote from somebody, you just got a part of your character that was embodying this. And so from this, we birthed these 400 people who played and danced and roamed in alternative states and questioned what was authentically real and what was not. And it was that latter moment that really kind of triggered us and gave us hope, because we never really aimed to create seamless characters or polished, defined bodies acting out directions. We wanted this kind of bleed, and we wanted to shape people's connection to the architecture of the rational. And this piece of participatory role-playing co-immersion, we knew right at the start that we weren't writing LARPs in the traditional sense. We weren't game masters. It was a lot more messy and difficult than that. We also weren't directing immersive theater. There was something very specific about those people and their personal experiences blending onto our artworks, and that was the thing that was really, I think, very interesting for us. And we knew that our kind of language was quite different to more traditional role-playing elements, and so was our kind of incentives for doing that. So we began to call our spaces real gameplays, and they sat inside this framework of art, and this is our landscape. not LARP or role play. Because of course LARP and role play, they have their very, very strong communities. They don't need the art world. And I think that's also a very specific thing to mention, that this is about looking towards what those histories of LARP and those histories of role play have actually done, and that there is still a really growing, strong emergence of threads that are activated within that. But this is not necessarily a one-for-one or apples to pears that we're trying to create. Just for anybody who's still a little bit unsure, I'm going to just read you a definition. So, live-action role-playing games are a form of role-playing games where the participants physically act out their characters' actions. So this normally means that there's like a game master, that's a very specific narrative, and that you're kind of, in a sense, staying quite tightly to that narrative. Whereas what we try to do is mix the narrative within your own identity and your lived experience, and we kind of think of it more of like a meta structure of you and the character that's given to you. So our definition of real gameplay simply works between the states of your former self and the self that you've been given to play out, and it places itself, of course, inside this bleed artwork zone. And of course, in a way, as well as every artwork is, it's open to everyone to experience. Some will bond to it and return over and over again, which is actually kind of amazing. We have such a strong community of people who keep coming back to our works. And other people will hate it. Every experience is, of course, unique, and no one can ever experience the work in the same state as any other person. This is, of course, the essence of real gameplay, and underplay pins quite a lot of the motivations for actually working with it. So I do just want to explain a little bit about how we go about creating these works. Quite simply, it normally works within an open call that goes out to the public. And normally those works sit within museums or institutions, and these open calls may have questionnaires attached to them. They may be on a first come, first base, and there's kind of like a brief about what the world would actually be like, that we would be inhabiting, and then the duration. And from that, people can sign up to it. But there's like a few more steps that people would have to do before they actually enter this world. And one of them is a workshop that we run, which is actually pretty long. It's normally around 6 to 8 hours, continually without any breaks. So this is already like kind of a lot for a lot of people, especially in our accelerated world. So bear in mind that not only do you have to learn a new identity or character, maybe a set of skills, but then you also end up in this very long workshop. And then eventually you also will, of course, enter the space of the world, which we role play, which is full immersion. So that means that there's like no breaks. It's like run continually. And the shortest of those is 5 hours that we've done, and the longest one was 2 months. And so the world would then become activated. We do, of course, have within those worlds safe codes. So if there is a problem, then of course there is these moments to break or cut play. But generally these would run through, and then we always have like debrief sessions afterwards with the people that have worked with us, so all the public, and then we normally go for dinner. So really, in a way, a lot of these works, they're very, very fragile, and they really require the structure and also the commitment, because of course, you know, right now, technically I'm role-playing. Sorry, the mic. I'm role-playing to you, but without your kind of commitment of listening to me speaking. Like, if you were all just doing your own shit right now, like, I wouldn't really be able to role-play this idea of us having a lecture. So you sort of see what I mean. Like, there's like a difficulty if not everybody in the room commits to the reality that that we are creating. And I think that's also a lot of the reason why we do the works that we do, because in a way it's kind of crazy that if a number of people actually commit to a certain reality, it actually becomes the reality. So it's a lot about asking, how many people does it require to change reality from the status quo? So maybe now I will just talk a little bit to a few of the works. And yeah, then maybe we can have questions. So, a lot of the works that we create often move around kind of speculative fictions, new technologies, ways in which collectivity enact themselves. So this particular piece here was done at the Volksbühne here in Berlin, and it was part of the Technobodies series, which was curated by Yvonne Seidler. And this particular work was called Smile, A Trip into Synthesia. And it was around 5 hours, so it was a very, very short work. But it had around 30 public participants. So these participants that you see on the screen, they very infrequently know each other before they've signed up. So a lot about the workshop is actually about getting to know each other, actually creating reality, or the reality that you live in, like what are the ways in which you embody or react to each other, what is this kind of shared cultural knowledge, slang, ideas that you formulate. So this particular piece, I just want to read the kind of framing that we offered to people before they signed up. So this is an excerpt from an article that was entitled Beyond Politics, found on a public transport in Berlin. The source is unknown as the article was ripped out, and it was dated the 7th of October, 2022. Since 2025, the globe has seen an increased interest in young people who have been mentally affected by the modern electronic media, beginning to experiment with smile ceremonies, the reason being that their nervous systems have evolved from electronic media so much that they can no longer enjoy linear drugs like alcohol, but instead are interested in non-linear experiments with chemical highs, trancing, and journeying. Their aims are diverse, but it is common to find them searching for states of increased intelligence, social intimacy, space migration, and life extension. The model that they use is known typically as Smile by its users. In short, Smile is a 5-hour cycle ceremony which aims to blend all 7 senses into clarity. It is often said by the users that in the last 135 minutes, 18 barriers are crossed, i.e. barriers comparable to the appearance of life, the invention of language, or the achievement of immortality. 13 of them are crossed in the last 10 seconds. These 18 extensions of consciousness and power are comparable to the passing of sea to land, or from Earth to space, or at least that's what most seasoned users boast. It is not exclusive, but individual needs proof of stake before they can enter the ceremony to ensure bodying satisfaction for all involved. Though they do welcome beginners warmly, Belief Unlimited will host a Smile session in Berlin exploring human fluidity in the age of technological precision. Never forget, the mind coils back to the birth of time. Zen Speed Organic, 3 lifestyle diets. So this was the sort of setting of this work, and the images that you've just seen in front of you are just extracts of these 5 hours that were the cycle ceremony. And also kind of a strong part of this work was also to create this sort of seeing of Western society, which always kind of posits technology as like external to the human. Yet it's becoming more and more obvious that digital technology has always been an extension of the human and a kind of fabrication of extra reality and another version of seeing life. So actually a lot of the works that we create, we do have these moments where we do program new technologies, such as when I spoke about the crypto wave series, where we did have the Monero miner, which is actually connected to a Monero mining wallet. But also it's very much about beginning to think about technological structures through embodied knowledge and taking that way back to a kind of more analog human repertoire. And speaking of kind of embodied knowledge, I want to speak briefly to unrealism, which was actually the longest work that we ever did, and that was for 58 days, and it was 24/7 live. The work was a kind of multi-modal approach to exploring the idea of life online as cosmic depression, paradise without ecology. And we wanted to explore this notion that today online reality fundamentally changes the way we live, work, and socialize. Speaking of embodied knowledge and technology, I think I lost mine. There we go. Where was I? Yes, so thinking about like how technology works and socializes and how that like becomes embodied to us, and not trying to think about the avatar as an abstraction, but trying to actually pull the two together into what is probably more of a reasonable way in which we actually think about the digital self to the physical self. And of course, through the speed and breadth and depth of current breakthroughs in online culture, we are sort of at this historical precedence of erupting in very much almost every society on the planet, whether or not that's actually also through the lack of technology in certain places, but it's very much fundamentally shaping the planet. And we can no longer, if we ever could, separate online and offline life. It has become a kind of constant regurgitation of itself, an immortal Ouroboros, a living fiction of our times, but we actually very rarely call it fiction. The internet has become this kind of illegitimate child of journalism and a teenager with no authority or guidance. And this has actually also, of course, allowed for radical voices to appear in our discourse, for better or worse, new fetishes and addictions to be formed, and a whole new universal economy to be birthed via a string of avatars and personas that inhabit this kind of digital multiverse. And so these were the sort of webs and stories that informed unrealism. But this work was not of the genesis of Guy Debord's dooming narrative of zombification through simulation, but instead looking more at technology as a trickster archetype, which is a kind of akin to technology on a whole. The trickster often shows intelligence and fares in unpredictable and chaotic worlds, with its spirit and its kind of mischievous riddling. And this was really the kind of point to where unrealism began. The idea behind this piece was that actually Unrealism birthed an 8-chapter book, which was a kind of created through this beta world where life online was the primary life of the individual, being Eastern Agrippa, who you see on the left-hand side here. And a lot of what Eastern Agrippa was interested in was whether actually one can survive online alone. And so Eastern Agrippa spent 58 days inside an apartment that was specifically created for Eastern, built around Eastern's character and personality tropes, and that was actually the only place that Eastern existed in the physical realm. But of course, Eastern had this entire metaverse in front of them from their screen. And that actually went out to a Discord channel, which had, I think, around 175 participants who were activating and speaking and playing with Eastern Agrippa. And this was all those people who were actually from this like open call at the beginning, who then were informed about how Eastern would work. So this was sort of like one vessel that was fairly tight to Unrealism. But then the other part of it was that this was actually part of an exhibition at Kunstraum Batanien. And so inside the exhibition space, there was also a one-for-one copy of Eastern Agrippa's apartment, but altered to become an installation that allowed the viewer to be able to sit down in the same space as Eastern would inhabit, but you had 2 screens that would stream Eastern's apartment on the left and Eastern's screen on the right, and then you had your own screen in front of you that you could communicate with the rest of the community. And this was really sort of how it was documented throughout that period of time to the public. And as I said, it was running live for these 58 days. But what is important to say is that you could only see what Eastern was doing inside the exhibition space. It wasn't streamed to the World Wide Web. So it wasn't this kind of that anybody could, you would have to physically go into the exhibition room if you wanted to have that type of participation. So this actually became, so this is Eastern's life a bit, and actually here I have a picture where you can see what the gallery space looked like. Another work that I would, maybe it's important as well to tell you that this piece was actually ran in 2020. It was decided way before we knew about the lockdown, pandemic, living online. It was actually created as an idea in 2019, this summer. So this actually also was kind of a crazy moment to produce this type of work, because also, of course, we did have the lockdown. We also had these kind of amazing moments where, you know, Black Lives Matter, COVID-19, all of these kind of positions that actually hit internet life quite strongly. So all of that was, of course, feeding into the work itself. But of course, like, we had no control over that. That was just basically what was happening. And that's maybe also that moment of bleed that I'm trying to speak to, how actually the real world will then continually rewrite whatever work you're doing anyway, because of course there is these kind of constant thematics. Another part of what we're really interested in is these kind of alternative genealogies, and I guess that also speaks a lot to Eastern Agrippa, the alternative genealogy of the avatar actually, you know, being a living cell. And another work that we just recently shown at Ljubljana Biennale is called Utopias. And this is actually a work that has gone through many different ways of distilling it It was originally a work that was performed by 8 of us, which was actually not public for the very fact that we consumed LSD and role-played on LSD to try to find the primary structures of virtual reality. After a lot of research, what one can typically find within the lens of virtual reality is that a lot of these systems actually come back to kind of chemical consoles, whether that be from something like LSD, but also through different trancing techniques. And the sort of history of Silicon Valley and the movements towards these new technologies of creating other worlds are typically rooted in a lot of these moments and positions. And of course, in a sense, LSD literally does position another world on top of the world that your body is. Only, of course, it's a little more unruly than virtual reality because there's not generally a kind of on-off switch to it. And so, in a way, this particular work was looking at this kind of psychedelic movement alongside computing technology, but it was also really thinking about how we traverse backwards into analog technologies in order to uproot new and alternative modes of thinking about technology. And its aim was to begin to understand the many ways in which modern world has found itself on drugs. I don't mean here street drugs, I mean more kind of psychopharmaceutical enhancement technologies, virtual, and so forth. We are drugged. It is well known that when you follow the drug trail, the psychoactive substances that have been integral to the building of new economies, politics, media, and of course code, are actually drugs of culture. They have influenced art and poetry, philosophy, and therapy. And they begin to open up debates on neurochemistry of the human mind and also what its subcultures have never really been drug-free. And these thematics around understanding acid as a primal technology have been the belief in understanding this kind of tab for another world. And in a way, the users were 8 people who were exploring the collective mind made cosmic or neurocosmic through social intelligence, technological extensions, and radical holographic imagineering. And the way in which we worked through this is, I don't know if you can read that so well, it's kind of small. But basically, you can see here we created a timeline of this alternative genealogy of virtual reality. If anyone's interested, I can also share it with you after. And of course, time in our belief is circular rather than linear. So of course, the past is constantly writing the present, the future is editing the past, and the present is somehow a multiverse of all of them. And over this piece, Utopiates, what you can see here is a little bit of documentation of the people who participated, but alongside them, it wasn't just about taking acid. There was still structures involved. So we had these trip diaries where we created experience and recording charts, which you can see in the pale pink. And actually through the whole duration of this trip, we all were mic'd up, so we were recording all of our conversations. So we had a sort of archival database of the discussions that we were unpacking so that we could go into it later on, which was then actually also taken and mixed down into a 1-hour sound piece. So here you have Rain on the left-hand side and their interpersonal trip report. And these were over the course of 2 hours. We had to keep filling in these papers. Azira's, theirs. And so it kind of went on like this throughout the piece itself. But then we also decided to take it one step further, and we created this performance lecture where we took 2 of the characters and began unpacking a lot more of the content and structures that were coming up in the real gameplay, and then trying to find out or fit together how they all sort of tangentially sit together. So this is a video work that was extracted out of it. And then recently we actually also created the Utopia's extension pack, which was specifically done for Ljubljana Biennial, which actually aims to create a kind of sentient bot, so a semi-intelligent bot that basically takes the user through some of the questions that we came up with collectively through this Utopia's world. And it kind of takes you through these different systems, and then it takes you out at the end into an augmented reality infrastructure that we think is somehow a visualization of what we found during our role-playing experiments, which also has a really amazing sound score by Lemon Boy. And yeah, I hope that in a way that made sense, or at least allowed you to see some of the ways in which we work. Of course, a lot of this work is very much based on the experience. And it also always, for me, as I'm presenting this work, like I see these images of these characters, and I of course like have a relationship with these characters, and I remember a lot of things which I like can't really express to you because of course in a way they're like my personal memories. And I think that that's something that I will never be able to get across when I'm giving a talk like this, because I think that so much of the work that we create is very much about living within the context of the work and finding that difficult, but also maybe rewarding. And it was also very interesting to listen at the beginning when you spoke about how the feedback points, and I guess that was also when I was listening to that, it was me listening to something I hadn't experienced. And I feel somehow I've just replicated that to you. But I would be really happy if you had any questions. Thank you.
Literally mind-blowing. And we start with, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. In the meanwhile, you guys can start rattling in your brain and come up with questions too. No, you literally like blew up our doors of perception to stay within your psychedelic metaphors. And during a lot of terms also that are maybe new to some, that kind of triggered a lot of different thoughts on my behalf as well. In a way, when you started talking about the bleed space in the beginning, that was really an eye-opener for me. And that's something that's going to for sure stick with me after today. That you said like bleed, the space that you call bleed is half fiction and half reality. But in a way, couldn't we argue that all art or artistic production is such a bleed space situated somewhat in between reality and fiction?
I guess that depends very much on the artist's intention. I mean, I think, like for example, oh my god, the name is just totally gone out of my head.
Maybe you find another example.
But I want this one, it's so important. It's a group outside, maybe you can help me. It's a group who are basically working outside of Goldsmiths University. They are investigating a lot.
Forensic architecture.
Thank you. Forensic architecture. I would say that what forensic architecture are doing are actually not create, they're basically positioning reality inside the sphere of the art world. And I think their intention would be the total opposite of creating bleed in a way, because they really want us to walk away with information that is occurring, and it's almost like opening a doorway to the world that we are not seeing. So I think in that sense, there is a lot examples that I think aren't trying to work in this way, but I also totally follow what you're saying in the sense that a lot of people's artistic intentions are, of course, inevitably built on the structure of the world that we live in or their personal experience. And also, in a sense, what's I think beautiful about this moment of bleed is like it can be super irrational. And I think a lot of art practices are very irrational, which is also why it's funny when you have these kind of talks in a way, because you're sort of explaining your irrational cosmos and your soul to people that you're basically trying to say, this is rational, but of course it's not, it's irrational.
No, it made me also think that in a way you could say, I mean, using the word fiction brings us to the idea of the narrative and narration and storytelling, that basically the greatest driving forces of humankind or civilization per se are fantastic fictions or narratives, whether it's the myth or the archetype that you mentioned, or it's religion or even science fiction, no? From Jules Verne to William Gibson. That is now, you know, and so forth and so on. So you can draw that red line throughout the history of humankind.
Yeah, and actually, even now, it's really interesting that suddenly it seems that the wider, greater powers are even like totally taking hold of these. For example, in the south of Germany, there's a university there that has a literature department that basically has a special PSYOPs that's specifically for the German government, where they're looking at literature across the world and pinpointing where they think the next eruption will be, and where you need to sort of like cybernetics 101 thermostat that in order to take down the kind of detrimental damage that these inflictions could occur. So you even begin to see this now actually being taken to maybe a more rational level of understanding how fiction can alter reality. There's also a lot of theories around the idea that if one person thought something, it's probably going to be thought by many and therefore brought into the lived world. So I think this is also the reason why I think art is so powerful. And art is fucked up as well. It's not a cool space. A lot of the time it's super biased. There's a lot of problems, whether that be through gender, race equality, and so forth. But I think what is strong about art is that we do have that tool of being able to communicate and to position these kind of social evolution. I mean, you can also not even look at it through the lens of art, but a lot of like gaming communities say that, you know, if we could test bed the problems of the world, like climate change, through gaming consoles, then we might not actually make so many detrimental fuck-ups as we could continually press restart without doing it on society.
Maybe picking up on the notion of gaming, which obviously is very key to your entire practice, made me then think again that also this idea of, I mean, the idea of the world as a stage, the theatrum mundi, that basically everything that we perform, that we live is a performance, or even the notion, maybe you're familiar with it, that the term personality, you know, like I'm really into etymology. If you have been here for the first lecture, comes from personare, and that was actually the name of the mask that was used in the Greek theater. So the personality means the sound that came through the mask. So personality means basically a mask. So this being said, this whole discourse that you're bringing up, like the ludic nature of it, in a way, how does that play into your into your work?
Do you mean like how do these topics like resonate inside?
Yes, and how did it start? This idea of rogue, it's still set apart in a way, but it's based on a notion, an idea, a philosophy that all of human interaction is a performance in one way or another, or the world is a stage.
Yeah, when did that start? Well, I mean, I think this probably began just through like a lot of people that are around me and around us, that we're thinking about these ideas of roles, or like who has the authority to make reality, like what infrastructural critiques can be made within society. And I think like this work is sort of just built up on like a lot of conversations, and most of those are like informal ones, like sitting around a dinner table, or being part of activist groups and grassroots organizations. And like these are kind of systems and conversations that have been going on for decades within the people that we're around. And I think that's probably the reason why we keep coming back to it, because like when you get a kind of topic that is so, it's like when you have this topic and then suddenly, you know, everything you sort of read or somebody says something, you're like, oh my God, this relates back to this relates back to this. And it's like, it's almost like, you're like, I can't get out of this topic right now. They're like the universe basically has driven me to this topic. Like,
and maybe a follow-up question, in a way, also your work always constitutes these, I think you call them meta-communities. So they're kind of social spaces that are, you know, in between the virtual and the real. But and they also allow people to kind of reinvent themselves, or they take over new identities and, you know, question the existing dominant narratives, so to speak. What has been your learning as a group, as a collective, also from the participants of these? You said there are debriefs afterwards, like we just learned from our last session, okay, you know, this is also a collective experiment in a way, what we're doing here.
Yeah,
what have you learned from your collaborators and participants?
Well, the collaborators, which I would definitely call everybody who participates a collaborator, because they're building the world alongside us. I mean, one thing definitely to say is that these people are insanely strong. It takes so much strength and humility to go and be another character, like to untether like you in your safe space of like your personality, your belief structures, your opinion, your way of living, like to untether all of that in a group of strangers is actually a really dynamic process. And I think that what we've been very lucky in the fact that the same people keep turning up, and that also creates like a community within the work, which is also kind of interesting in some ways. Like I was once after a debrief with like two people who were living in Berlin who keep coming to the works, and I was like, do you see each other when you're like not here? Are you friends now or what? And they were like, no. We don't see each other. I was like, well, why not? And they were like, it just wouldn't be, we'd never be able to have the same intensity in life as we do in these spaces. And this is like more why we come, because you can't replicate the intensity or acceleration outside of. I mean, also there's what's beautiful too within these communities is like the emails you get. Like sometimes years later, like two that come to mind is like one person emailed saying that they were going to be a dad, but their partner actually got pregnant with somebody else, but they weren't in an open relationship. But because he'd explored the idea of monogamy and different family structures in one of the games, that he was pulling on that knowledge in order to go forth with how he was going to accept that child into the family structure. So that was super sweet to receive like 2 years later. There's also been crazy emails about people, which I wouldn't necessarily say is a good thing. One person in this very first piece that we did, we had, it was actually the moment that the G20 was happening in Hamburg. And we had in front of the DJ booth a G20 summit flag. And one person had come and participated and didn't know what the G20 was. So they'd been seeing this image of the G20 throughout the whole night, of course. And then the next day they'd like gone and checked it out and decided to take them as their character to the G20 and basically experience the G20 summit as a protester in character. We did not encourage or incur any of this. This was this person's just interest to do this, I should say. Obviously, we can't be responsible when that like actually occurs, but they actually also wrote a really interesting email explaining that they'd done this and that they'd quit their job and that they were now thinking about different ways of living their life, to kind of put it in a nutshell. So there's like all of these crazy stories that we have come across over the years, but what I would say is, yeah, I mean, these works aren't possible without these phenomenal people that are somehow drawn to this work. And that should also be maybe saying that when we first created this work, we didn't think it would actually work. We thought we'd do this one role play. Would people really be interested in participating? Would there actually be people who would be willing to play a character in a strange, fragile world? It would be very easy to take the piss in this space. It would be very easy to dismantle it. Would people really want to do it? Would they think it was interesting? And I think I didn't really think they would. But then they did. And that was sort of like basically how this whole thing continues, is through the support and infrastructure of the viewers.
Great. And maybe a last double question before, I hope you made some notes and you have a question, and also you online, is what has been the best advice given to you on your pathway, and what advice would you give the becoming artists, architects, designers, and so forth here in the room and online?
The best advice. The best advice is, I think, from my friends, Ruth Catlow and Mark Garrett, who speak very much about radical friendships, about keeping the people that inspire you close and to work with the people that inspire you, getting the right people in the room. And that might actually be also what I would offer. I'm going to double it up, is that don't go into your art practice thinking about who you feel would be good to be around, but instead really go into your practice about who you're like speaking to and who's like getting you excited and who makes you feel safe and who asks those questions and who can criticize you and who do you really grow with. That would be what I would offer.
I think that's a beautiful advice. So that being said, should we have a little applause in between? Yes and no. I think that's very applause-worthy.
Great questions.
That being said, now questions from you, and actually now my fantastic tech team, Philippa, will join us in the front to get you guys also again up on the screen. And if I understood it right, but you can stay here.
Okay.
This mic is working, and so whoever asks comes to the front. Yeah. Okay. So I'll be the mic holder here. Has a long cable. Yeah. Shall we break the ice here? You have a question. And again, there's no such thing as a stupid question. I repeat it every time. Yeah, maybe you quickly introduce yourself, your name and what you study, and then
Mask?
when you speak, you don't need to have a mask.
I'm Miriam. I'm in Bildende Kunst.
Is it working?
Hello?
Is it on?
Oh, that's actually.
Now?
Yeah.
It's working? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm Miriam in Bildende Kunst. And I had a question about how narrative plays into your work and how do you always use narrative structures, or are there other structures that you can use to create realities, and in which ways have you seen those then, like have you been able to apply those structures in reality to shift certain things? Mm-hmm. Or like how have you seen these kinds of modes of creating reality that maybe are not narrative in non-narrative structures, I guess, maybe is, Or do these worlds have to exist within a narrative, and then how does that affect your work?
I think that's a really great question. I think that there is a lot of non-narrative infrastructures that you can use.
Like space, like
yeah, exactly. Installational spaces that you build out, which I think you could see is like something that we often work with, whether that's like a found space or a space that you build yourself. There's also ways that you can use language to implement, or actually non-language. And also, I think, especially with the smile piece, there was very little verbalization, and this wasn't something that we expected, but that actually everything became from the body. So they were using a lot of movement to generate like emotion and also topics. So this was something. I think as far as like the use of narrative, when you're like trying to onboard people, it's really good to have something that they can kind of hold on to, unless you have like an infinite amount of time. So if you're sort of positioning a little bit the sort of area, it makes like what happens here much more rich in our experience, whereas if you sort of like give this, it's nobody will know what's going on. So yeah, I think it depends like how much time or space or you have with the people, like how much you have to like kind of pin stuff. Did that answer?
Yeah.
But I would definitely say the body.
So that, sorry. Okay. Just wanted to know if there's spaces where you've created like maybe mini versions or like things that are analogous to these kinds of worlds that don't necessarily have this kind of narrative.
Yeah, I would say probably within every world, there's like these kind of nebulous versions that I might not even know about, because there might be between two people that I never get and I never get into that connection. So I think these are like always happening. And I think this happens a lot with like body language and references and imagery, and like, I mean, even we speak about space, but we could also speak about clothing or costume, or like, you know, this is all language that I'm like informationally giving to you as you are to me. And I think like, there is so many structures in this way.
Great question, great answer. Mic's still off. Before, I have another question from the audience. You guys, online, you can just speak up. All over here.
Hi.
You hear me?
Almost. Say it again. I heard something, but not loud enough.
You hear me now? Okay, I'm Tim. I study fashion. I have two questions. One is how important is fashion in your experiences? And the other one is how do you finance your experience?
So fashion is very important. Also because when you're building an identity or a character, actually a lot of what we give to the participants who work with us is we often say that like maybe you should start by actually what you wear or objects that you would bring with you, because you can definitely kind of root or position. It's a little bit how you were mentioning the mask. So like what you actually show to the outside is immediately, okay, if I'm dressed a certain way, you're going to respond to me in that way because the visual language is what you will see first and foremost. And if I was here in, I don't know, a suit, then of course you would have a very different understanding, because as human beings we are actually very judgmental, I think, and we do read visual language. So in that sense, I would say that it's extremely important, or at least as a tool of beginning and a re-identifying process. And how do we fund these pieces? Well, we're very lucky. For some reason, we have been able to fund them through the institutions that ask us to do the works. So this is normally how we fund them. We have a budget. We also have some patrons that have helped with certain projects over the years. But normally we would be working solely with the institution that has invited us to create the works. We try to make all of our works free to participate within. There shouldn't be any cost, ideally. That we've only ever had to charge for one, and that was because of the German Senate regulations of theater. You're not allowed to put on theater for free.
Question from the audience.
Hey,
Wait, my mic is not so sounding great. Yeah, actually it is.
hello, I'm Theo. Thank you very much for your beautiful lecture. So first, you mentioned immersive theater, and I was wondering how would you position your creative practice in relation to traditional theater, but also to immersive theater, or to, for example, I was thinking of Japanese traditional theater at a point, and to the Gutai movement. Would you say that there is a continuity between these, or would you rather compare it to the way internet is in relationship to the libraries? That's what I was thinking at the point.
It's interesting that you bring Buto up, because actually, although we never really perform in a Buto sense, but actually in these workshops we use a lot of Buto strategies that evoke.
Briefly say two words. Who's Buto and what's a Buto strategy?
Buto is. Would you be able to give a really good definition? Oh, okay, then I give a half-fact version. So Buto is basically a type of dance which was, let's say, arguably one of the first types of dance that brought traditional Japanese dance into the Western European formations. And a lot of Buto is specifically about working with spirits or entities that are inside your body. So instead of the dancer like performing a character, it's like finding a character like within the stomach or the mind, and then utilizing and decoding this for an audience. So there's a lot of strategies around like trancing, mental work, physical work, which actually this is predominantly what we work with in our workshops. We don't traditionally use like improvised theater techniques. It's actually a lot more of finding space and like embodied knowledge that we work with. And I would say probably the big difference between the theater and what we do is we don't have an audience per se. Like you wouldn't be able to come and watch these worlds unless there was like a reason in the world why there was an audience. But in a sense, the audience is the participants who are, they're in a way performing for each other, or they're like socially evolving this world for each other. So in a sense, that's maybe the bigger difference. And yeah, maybe just sort of to clarify that we're normally working in like more kind of art contexts of museums rather than theaters. But theaters do seem to ask us sometimes to do works there too.
Again, a great question and a great answer. I'm learning a lot tonight. I'm looking at you guys on the screen. Another question from the remotely watching audience. And another question from you guys.
Sorry. Can I ask? Sorry. I will turn on my video. Okay. Hi, I'm Lena. Thank you for the talk. I study GWK, which is Communication in Social and Economic Contexts. And I have a question just out of curiosity. If you ever heard of someone who was addicted to the real game plays because they, I don't know, love their new selves or the other selves so much, or they, yes, they really understand things better now, and they want to like understand it more and more.
I think that's a very in my head I'm like reveling through lots of conversations in relation to that answer, wondering whether I can say any of them publicly or not. I would say that yeah, I think it does happen, but I guess a lot of the hope of this type of work as well, or like which wasn't an original intention, but something that kind of came out over the years, is that like hopefully there's like a little bit of those characters that like either makes you feel strong or empowered, or that you can like always activate. I mean, I can definitely say that from a personal experience, rather than telling other people's anecdotes, there is a lot of characters that I've played over the years, and they all kind of helped me navigate, particularly this professional world of the art world. And they also allow me to navigate specific positions where maybe I would feel vulnerable. And so I've like learned alongside this process about ways to kind of strengthen my armor, so to speak. As far as addiction is concerned, I can definitely say that two people who played completely changed their lives in order to fit with the characters that they created together.
So, yeah, there's another. Would you mind coming? The mic line is long, but not so long. So I would say one more question from the audience now, and one more for you guys remotely, and then we wrap it up.
Okay, thank you for your lecture. I'm Julian, studying communication as well. What I'm curious about is if you can share any experiences of people like breaking the character, or like leaving the character, or like, let's say, reinterpreting the character, and when to a certain extent where it gets like out of control during that moment, during that situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. As far as breaking the character is concerned, I think this is very natural, because in a way you build your character, and then you like go into a room, and then like suddenly you have to sort of break or adapt or move, because also the narrative moves, and you find that like you can't really be your character, so you kind of have to like change it in order to speak to or reverberate from someone else. Like, I think this is also kind of normal, so should be encouraged, which is maybe actually a little bit different to traditional LARP, where it's more told that you should keep in this specific character because there's these kind of unfolding of events. There has been, over the years, like 2 incidents where people have broken characters, and it's kind of been really, really difficult. The first time was somebody who basically just didn't want to participate, I think, but then stayed to participate. And the ways that they were reacting, like they also knew somebody else in the world, and so they were like calling them by their real name, and this was very, very disruptive. And because this is also really disruptive for that other person too, because they were trying to play and then they kept like being pulled out of it. And I actually have to say that in this case, maybe we did like the wrong thing, but probably the good leftist thing of like saying like, oh, but you know, maybe if you don't want to be here, like you can leave. And they were like, no, 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 we want to stay. And this was actually a real problem because, of course, like the world is so fragile that like actually if you have one person who's not participating, like the whole thing breaks down. So that was how not to do it. So now I think we actually have like a more of like a sort of kind bouncer way of dealing with these things of like really, because sometimes it's just not the right moment. And that doesn't mean that like you can never come back or like you should never ever attempt role-playing ever again. It's just sometimes not the right moment to be there. And it might just not be what you're interested in at that moment either. So I think that the second time that this happened, we were the kind bouncer and said, yeah, maybe this is not the right space. And I think it was the right choice to make. And this is also the reason why we have these very long workshops, is because at that moment, you've kind of gone through like 6-8 hours with this group of people. Like you understand like that it's kind of weird what we're doing. And if that's not right for you, you don't have to show up the next day. But if you only had like an hour workshop, you sort of might not recognize that. So I would say that the workshop actually kind of helps a lot to navigate like these people away from being part of it at that moment if it's not right for them. I will also say that this is not like all sunshine and enlightenment. There is a lot of tears. There is a lot of like very difficult things that occur in these worlds. Like it's hard and people find it difficult at times. And I mean, this is also what we want to make work like. And that's, we're really interested in being in difficult places and navigating them collectively and trying to work out like the euphoria and the dark shadows. And I mean, like a lot of our work is actually based on like our connection to like rave culture and growing up in like working class parts of north of England where like you kind of, you know, those spaces like there's all different types of scars on your body. Sometimes they're beautiful and you never want to forget them, and sometimes they're not. And this is something that we're really interested in, trying to bring those two places together. So yeah, I also just want to say it's not all sunshine and rainbows.
So looking at the watch, maybe one, if there's another question from you guys online, one short question and a short answer.
Hi. I'm Lena, I study architecture. So, and my question is, you mentioned earlier how the avatar is not seen as an abstraction, but rather that the digital self and the physical self is ultimately seen as one. So what, in your eyes, is abstraction, if not a simplified portion of reality set into a specific surrounding?
What is my... I couldn't really hear. It was crackling a bit.
Because you were making the differentiation between abstraction or saying that the avatar is not an abstraction, but rather one part of, like, or that the digital self and the physical self is rather seen as one. So I was wondering what you meant by abstraction, because it seems to play a big role in everything that you do. Like, what is abstraction and what is reality, for example?
Okay, I think...
Thank you.
So the avatar, I think that we work in abstraction, if that's what you mean. I think that they're, like, all of these worlds are, in a sense, shades of the world that we find ourselves in. So they're all sort of a close or near reality. But I think that if I pick up on it correctly speaking, we would argue that the avatar, in the sense of unrealism, is not an abstraction to the human body. So maybe more like arguing within like Legacy Russell's idea of like the Glitch Manifesto, where the avatar is actually the human being behind the computer, and they are one, and they are embodied, and they are localized, sometimes in this digital metaverse, because it's the safest place to be their self. You know, there is like sometimes an avatar is the human body as reincarnate of pixels, because that human body, to be who they are on the streets or in the world, is too dangerous. So they actually augment themselves in order to live their true life. And so I think if I'm answering this correctly, or maybe if you could extend.
Maybe, I think it was a great answer, and looking at the time, Helen, I hope this brought you in some direction, but I was thinking, there was a lot of things mentioned. Maybe I could ask you a favor on behalf of the class, that you could provide me some links, like the Glitch Manifesto you mentioned, or some of the theoretical backdrop that you mentioned, even
Sure.
to the Japanese theater, maybe in our conversation, that I could then put in the group chat, so to speak, because there was a lot also for me to kind of pick up on and read up. And additionally, I love what's the lucid software diagram, no? This kind of alternate genealogy. Maybe, if that's okay, that could also be shared with the students, because there's amazing points on that line.
I can share the lecture of this, if you like.
Yeah, I think that would probably be taken with great enthusiasm from the group. That being said, thank you. It was amazing, really mind-opening, very, very inspirational, a lot of new information for me too. I hope you feel the same way, that are with us here today, and you that have joined us now remotely. So first of all, again, another warm applause for Omsk Social Club. And a big applause to the entire Studium Generale team for setting this up, and a big applause for you guys, joining us here every Monday in the room and online. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay weird, stay difficult, and let it bleed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.